This conversation is going to be about navigating the EU's evolving regulatory landscape, and this idea of trying to balance. I know they'll come. It happens. If not, we're filming it, so it'll be used afterwards. But balancing innovation with compliance and physical security. With all the changes and everything that's happening, if you take a look at our industry, historically it's been a high security industry where compliance has basically been our steady state. This idea around innovation, conveniences, things like that have sort of started to seep into each other. The other thing being, too, you've got things like the EU AI Act and other compliance things, too, like the European Green Deal and whatnot that we'll get into. So let's have a conversation around that. My first question I have for you is, with the EU AI Act introducing tiered risk categories for AI, how are you recalibrating, and what advice do you have based on your product development processes to ensure compliance while still delivering advanced analytics and automation capabilities that customers demand? So based off of the EU AI Act introducing these risk categories, how are you advancing your products to be able to deliver automation, analytics, and capabilities that your customers want?
So I've got the microphone, so I'll take a lead on this one. I think that there's like 4 levels, and I think in security we're looking at a higher level for the AI. And I think when you look at what the requirements at that level consist of in terms of risk and quality and documentation, etc., I think that really those things are very, very sensible. They align really with the sort of things that we do in the security industry anyway as a rule in terms of risk mitigation. And we want to ensure that as suppliers of solutions that protect organizations, which is fundamental, that's the first thing, we're there to manage risk. I know there's all the other great stuff that we can do around there in terms of business enablement and all the value adds we've been talking about a lot today. But first and foremost, risk management. So we can't at any space introduce something novel and new and exciting like AI and all the promise that it brings, but introduce a vulnerability. So we kind of have to align that with our core deliverable is security in the first place. And I think the other thing there is that with the EU AI and just the awareness, because I know it's mainly EU, and of course we still have the UK to consider as well, that it puts it out there for everybody to be aware of. And of course everyone should be aware of. But I have kind of been, speaking to end clients about the adoption of AI and how they receive the AI, through the security industry as well, is sometimes it's a bit over-enthusiastic. Suddenly they find a solution has been delivered, and hey, guess what, guys? We've just delivered AI for you. What the hell have you done? We didn't ask for this. We're not ready for it. We've got governance that should protect us. You need to tell us. So having a level of high-level kind of risk associated to AI, I think is only a good thing.
So I kind of break into 2 categories. One is on the application of it physically, so call that root of trust for a second. The second is on the workflow and the application which it's actually trying to accomplish. So on the first one, there needs to be effective. There's no real attestation at this point, but there needs to be effectively an attestation of what you're doing and how you're securing the thing that you are doing. So, for example, if you're doing biometrics, that all uses AI today. We can easily explain that. But there needs to be that root of trust that can be pointed to that the information that you are performing the AI on is secure. The second category, though, around the workflows themselves, I just gave a thing last week in Vegas at ISC about this. There are certain things you can automate because they're really well defined and they've got very clear triggers and they're very binary. There are certain things that you're going to get yourself in a whole lot of trouble if you automate today. So there's a lot of talk about application of AI in surveillance, and I think that's very interesting, but I also think that some science fiction movies are very interesting, and I also find horror films very interesting. I don't like that because I like it for 2 reasons, and my premise here, and I do like it and I don't like it for 2 reasons. I like it because you can generate a false positive and send a human being out to go verify. And in our industry, false positives, they're not great, but they're a lot better because if you're going to roll a person out to go verify that, this motion of, is this a hug or did somebody pull a weapon out and is pointing it? They're very similar physical motions, but they can generate the same alarm. And I don't want to send people out for hugs, but I also don't want to not send people out for guns. And that's kind of the thing I spend a lot of time thinking about, and probably way too much time losing sleep over, is in the misapplication and the false negatives, and then having too much trust on the workflow and resulting false negative when you don't send a person out to go find a thing. So
yeah, I would just start the edge. So we are the software provider in the industry. For us, it's a huge chance, of course, to introduce the AI. But I want to specifically focus on the regulation itself. So it has 4 levels, and physical security is high security risk. That means that you have to log everything you've done. You have to incorporate human intervention into all of the software you provide. That means that everything that algorithm decides for you and handles proactively security, this nice feature that AI brings, you have to incorporate in the software to roll back with a human factor, because it might be a wrong decision. If the security manufacturer is providing the functionality with AI module, the AI regulations are different in US and Europe, obviously. I would focus to separate this module as a complete different entity that you can enroll and update separately on your cameras, on your controllers. So this should be an isolated, monitored, transparently logging module that you can perceivably to the users document what it does and what it does not, and how you verify that. That's very important for this regulation. That's basically the sense of it. How Europeans, that's the positive thing about that I'm European, so that's why I tell it.
Thank you. So from the cybersecurity point of view, I would say everything we've said here is correct. It underpins the need for cybersecurity. We speak about cameras, we speak about controllers. We've also got to remember what sits behind all that technology and how that technology is operating. So from a regulation point of view, it's key, and it's great that companies have to adhere to that standard. We've got an auditable record that we can ensure they do follow that standard, and it's not just the specific pieces of hardware that they are relying on, because there's an awful lot that sits behind it that we need to ensure that companies are adhering to.
So a couple follow-up questions, I guess, that triggered based off the conversation. First one being, is it easier or harder now when it's now more software focused than hardware, like you were saying? And then my second one is it a process of, well, you talked about separating, but I also wonder, is there a process of you find the most stringent one that is around and then are able to apply it to the different regions, or do you have like separate by everything and it's kind of like how you had separate hardware?
So let me answer one of the points and I'll pass it on. From my point of view, I'm not sure if it's any easier or any harder. I think it's different because depending on the technology that the companies are deploying, we always go back to basics. So some of the basics are still not being covered, they're still not being closed. Now that may be budgetary constraints, it may be a global decision not to proceed, but the threat and the vulnerability still exists, irrespective of what AI can or can't do.
I think there is a general paradigm shift. So from hardware to software completely, and AI just overemphasizes this. This is just much more. So AI itself means transition in security from reactive to proactive, or predictive, And that's basically a huge chance. But of course, a higher challenge for manufacturers. The complexity is much higher, and the speed how AI evolves is much higher than it used to be. So the business decisions has to be made much faster than before. That's what manufacturers have to think about.
So I'm sorry.
I was going to say, basically, I think, exactly following up on what you were saying there, I think about the question of, is it going to be harder? I think, yes, harder. Of course, there should be more scrutiny. If the regulation is really going to be a regulation that has teeth and has any value, then it should absolutely close out any kind of potential vulnerability. So that should make it harder. And I think by right, it should be harder. But then, of course, the pace of change the opportunity to do things faster, quicker, without any regulation might seem opportunistic and really, really something that is appealing to get there quicker. But I think it should be harder on the client side as well to say, wait a minute, before we adopt this, we need to scrutinize. We need to understand exactly what we're going to get from this and the longer journey that comes with it as well. So I think it should be harder from an end client's perspective of what they do, but also exactly following on from what you were saying as well.
Right. Lee knows this, so I'm going to be difficult. I think it's easier. And the reason I say that, not that it's technically easier, that's not the case at all, but because at least there'll be a framework. I think right now people are stuck in paralysis. They try stuff and they experiment in labs, and it's really cool in labs, and you put it in the real world and it blows up, and then people get in trouble. So there's a reticence to deploy meaningful technologies that can do things like automate certain processes and be somewhat predictive, because there is no real framework to keep them out of trouble when they deploy in the real world. What I'm excited about with this is that I think that framework, kind of like with GDPR, Europe was way, I mean, I live in the US, so take this with a grain of salt, but we're way behind where Europe is on a bunch of different things, let alone frameworks for security and privacy. So when you take into account what GDPR is allowed to have happen in Europe for the advancement of security and applications, I think this is going to do the same thing. I think it's going to actually help speed things up, at least in limited contexts. It's not going to be technically easier, but it's going to give at least the barriers and I guess the guardrails that people didn't have before.
All right, so shifting gears just a little bit, but still in the same realm. So as we look at the sustainability requirements as they're becoming more increasingly stringent, especially under the European Green Deal, what are some specific challenges you're facing in balancing that environmental compliance with performance and cost considerations, especially in physical security hardware? And what advice do you have for others that are looking at this as well? I'll start with you, Alistair.
I think number one, it's all good. Right? It's all good. I think that there is clearly pain there. There are clearly costs there. But for the greater good, for a securer future, to me it doesn't really matter. Yes, there's cost, yes, there's pain, there's change in process, there's change in regulatory compliance. The fact that I'm going to be audited on it, somebody's going to check and balance what I'm doing and what I'm delivering, I think is a good thing. I don't think there's any way back. You can dress it up in whatever way you want, but you've just got to accept it. You've got to be acceptance of what is coming, the changes, whether it's even something as basic as NIS2 in Europe. Here in UK, we don't have that same regulation around some of the businesses. We should have that regulation. We probably know that it's coming from the recent announcement last week from the UK government. But all I would say to people is simply embrace it and prepare for it, because there's no way out. There's nowhere to hide.
I would put a completely different perspective on that, because we are not the manufacturer. We are doing software. But sustainability, so how we can really influence that with your solutions. First of all, if you ensure the device lifetime through over-the-air updates through like 10 years or 15 years plus, so you already won. If you do the remote servicing and configuration of devices and don't have to drive somewhere, you reduce the impact. If you optimize the algorithms to reduce energy consumption and, for example, drive down the lockers while no one is working and power off for some non-critical stuff in the building, so you optimize the energy. So we are always looking from the software perspective, because we do not produce anything, but software really means for sustainability also a lot. And it will mean much more.
Yeah, I think we have the good fortune as well of only being a software vendor. So, in terms of thinking about hardware stuff is a luxury we don't have to think about. But we still occasionally have to buy in some equipment. So we have a burden of responsibility that, for example, printers, if we're going to use printers, that we need to know that we're sourcing something that's got the right level of sustainability in that as well, because we take that story forward, we pitch those products and add it into our solution. So it's not that we can ignore that kind of thing, but I think, as you were saying, Ivan, that the sustainability output, actually what you're going to achieve, should be the green line that runs really through the organization, and it's central to everything that we talk about in terms of security, because what we're securing is lifestyle, sustainability, the future. The closer that we connect all of those two things in a story, I think that's beneficial to everybody.
I'll take a very hardware-centric view of this, only because I agree with everything that was said actually so far. We're finally getting to a point where the compute power required at the edge is dropping down to milliwatt levels. So whereas before you had to backhaul everything, and it's not just the cost of the compute, then you're transporting videos and images back over a network that's got a huge environmental cost behind it, energy cost specifically, environmental derivative behind that. We're now at a point where we can do teraflop level operations down at the edge in extremely low power footprints. So there's a lot more that can be done at that level. Now if you hyper optimize and get everything running on a central server, it's always going to be more effective that or more power efficient that way, but it's not realistic in most cases, especially when you're doing things in either you've got cases where tens of thousands of people are walking around versus none. So I'm excited to see what a lot of the chip vendors, I'm not speaking on behalf of Intel here, but what a lot of the silicon vendors are popping up, the really small form factor edge stuff is getting very, very low power and can run on existing like camera footprint without additional power being run to it. So.
And I have seen actually security industry products, hardware products such as cameras, obviously power supplies, but even access control devices, putting their power consumption as a lead feature to show, these are low energy consuming products compared to a competitor, and putting that right at the front. Not only the sustainability in terms of the product, but actually power consumption as a leading feature.
Yep. All right, thank you. So now switch gears just a little bit. As you look at multiple EU member states, question is, how do you navigate the tension between local certification requirements and the need for standardization? I always talk about, if we take the North American market, what makes it a little bit easier there is primarily what's good for, say, Washington is good for Florida. And if you look at the sheer size of that marketplace, that's an attractive, approach because you don't have to worry about it. But here, you do have to worry about local certifications compared to country by country. So how do you balance that with the need for scaling and the need for growth?
Okay, I can start with software again. Sorry for that, we're a software company. So there are different regulations, especially for national security and governmental security, for critical infrastructures between Germany, France, UK. So basically what we do for our software, so I just leave the certification itself away. That's a process that costs money. You're in every country that you cannot avoid at the moment. What we are trying to do in software is to modularize basically the compliance components. So if you, for example, use encryption, you're in specific countries as France or UK, or US, you have to document the specific algorithms and NIST compliance of these algorithms. So that's what we have as a combination of modules and documentation that serves already in certification processes. So yes, we have that complexity in comparison to US, and yes, we are trying to handle it by pre-building and pre-certifiable stuff. So in simple words.
I was going to say that, sure, there's a great deal of fragmentation across Europe, right? And you have standards that apply in only one nation. You have, like in France, you have the ANSI standard, which only ever seems to mean anything, of course, within France. You take it into Germany, and there's nothing at all. And of course, that happens in the UK, that happens in Germany, and then within the rest, usually they follow something close behind that. And while there's a lot of similarities in those things, of course, it's usually the fact that you have to go and pay a lot of money to go and achieve those standards per country. It means you're duplicating and then reinterpreting, and that's a bit of a frustration, to be honest. It would be great if there was more commonality, and I think that it's likely that there will be more commonality to get there. I hope. The bigger standards, things like NIS2, even though you look at that and say, well, here's something that applies across the board everywhere. We can utilize that, what are characteristics of it for our products and what we do. The fact that it's actually applied in a rather fragmented way, it's a bit of a patchwork quilt because the adoption isn't consistent. So you still don't really know where you are. I think in the long term, it will become more consistent. But right now, yeah, you're always looking to see what's missing in one geography.
For us, just because of the nature of it being hardware plus software and you stick everything on a single device, it's really personally very frustrating when you've got to go back and do a redesign for a particular market. So we end up having to generally designed for the most stringent requirements with enough flexibility to be able to adapt out. But I think the market overall is going to move a lot faster when there's more commonality. It's at Lee's being very diplomatic when he says what's good for DC is good for Florida. We've got 50 states and about 375,000 different regulations. There are some that are fantastic and they're really well defined, and there's a lot of really loose stuff. So we end up essentially designing for the most stringent requirements in the U.S., which often end up being European requirements in the first place.
I think just to pick up on one of the points that you mentioned around cost and adoption and the interpretation of adoption. I understand that is the situation now in the status quo, but I think that will change very, very quickly as people become more aware. They probably fall foul of some of the standards because they don't fully understand the standard, and they'll very, very quickly adopt what the standard should be and therefore deliver what the standard is meant to deliver. The costs are a challenge for sure across Europe and across the different countries. For example, in the UK, this too is not something that needs to be adopted. In Europe it has, and we've got too many countries and too many individuals interpreting that in many different ways that doesn't work. I think 12, 24 months from now, we would see a huge difference in that and a greater adoption. It just becomes the norm.
Interesting.
Maybe just to add a little bit about directives as standards, I think it is important to point out here. So we in Europe like regulations and like to regulate. So initially we issue directives like NIS2. And then no one knows how to handle them. Yeah. So then every company has the CISO or whoever, and then decides, oh, now you have to be NIS2 compliant because we are going to become a critical infrastructure. What do? So you try to read this, 70-page document, yeah? So it was not really clear regulations. And out of that, so a lot of business has been generated at the moment. I think it's the main business driver now, in Europe at least, yeah? So we are lucky to have that, yeah? After some time, so like 2 or 3 years, there are initial standards that being developed or best practices based on that directive. The good thing is, so as a manufacturer, you have 2-3 years time to adopt. So you know this in advance. The bad thing is, different countries adopt it differently, but you still know it, yeah? And it costs. So I wanted to emphasize the journey from directives to European standards, national standards, to substandards of countries. That's how we live in Europe.
Nice. Sounds like it's good for consultants.
Some of those things are fine. I mean, when you look at some of the standards, things like the common criteria, which everyone, within like security systems can understand. If you're going to have a protective system, you want to measure it against something that people can understand. Common criteria, which is kind of universal, I think. NIST, International Security Standards for Technologies. Those things are kind of more universal. I'd like to see more of that, or at least connected into those standards.
All right. Well, gentlemen, I didn't think of all the panels we'd fill 30 minutes, but on the compliance and regulations we did. So congratulations on this one. That's good. Thank you all very much. I appreciate it. It is a ongoing conversation that we will continue. I like the 12 to 24 months type of thing. So I have a feeling this time next year when we come back, there'll probably be a full suite of other conversations to talk about. So thank you all very much. Appreciate it. Look forward to continuing the conversation. Thank you.